Nightmares. Suddenly the ghosts jump at your neck. They wrap themselves like a more and more tightly pulled rope around your neck. You only need to fasten one end to the ceiling. Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Lodewijk de Boer's play, The Buddha of Ceylon, or The Buddha of Ceylon, which I'm reading out of Dutch Plays by Nick Hearn International. So, this is a play I was really quite excited about, because it's a post-colonial play, and I'm very interested in post-colonialism. I had not really ever encountered Dutch post-colonialism, so I figured that would be very interesting. And I have mixed feelings about the play. I like a lot of its sort of thematic focus, but I'm also confused by it, and I will talk about that confusion. So, the play is set in a Dutch colony in South America in 1942, 43? 43, yeah. We follow Theodore de Boer, who's the colonial governor, his wife Athalie, Alban Zadok, who's a Jewish refugee who's just arrived from the Netherlands seeking refuge from the Nazis, Hannah, his wife, Prager, who's a sort of odd, possibly Nazi agent, possibly Dutch resistance agent. He's creepy. We'll put it that way for the moment. And then Sylvia, who is a servant in the colonial governor's mansion, house, whatever it is, who eventually leads a sort of resistance, or participates, centrally, in a resistance against Dutch colonialism. So, the play itself is really interested in drawing parallels between Dutch colonialism and the violence, the racism, the eugenics? I don't know exactly what the right form of the word I'm looking for is, but the eugenic mentality of Dutch colonialism and Nazism, which of course was starkly highlighted in the Netherlands in the very end of the 1930s. I think the Netherlands is conquered by 1940, if I'm not mistaken, but you can fact check me on that. But the Netherlands falls relatively quickly in World War II, and it's occupied by the Nazis after that, until it's liberated. There was a Dutch resistance in the same way that there was a French resistance, Greek resistance, Polish resistance, etc., etc. My sense is that the Dutch resistance was maybe not quite as vigorous as it was in some other places. I'm not assessing that because I don't know that much about it, but that's my sense. So, the cat's coming up over here to potentially get in my laundry basket. Anyway, so this play is set in a Dutch colony. Their hold on power is made much more tenuous by the fact that the Dutch government as such, the Dutch monarchy and government, is not exactly authoritative at this point. It is a government in exile. I think they set up in London, whereas the Netherlands itself was occupied. So, the colonial authority that derived its legitimacy from the reign of the monarch was somewhat less authoritative without that monarchy in place and actually ruling the home country. So, Theodore is navigating that. He's also navigating the fact that he's a huge fucking racist. He's also sexist. He continually talks down to his wife, insults her intelligence, even though she seems to be quite clever. And he basically just undercuts her at every turn. But he is this very, very sort of colonial, almost caricature of colonial racism. And you see this a lot in, say, British literature or post-colonial literature that I'm familiar with from former British colonies. You see this sort of almost stereotypes of the colonial officer who just thinks that the colonized people have no culture, they have no value, they're the repository of every vice under the sun, they're just always plotting to overthrow the colonial government, they're lazy, they are maybe satanic, whatever it is, all this bullshit. Theodore definitely is in that vein, and so he's actually quite an interesting character to make central to a play in 1943, set in 1943, because his ideology is not that far away from the Nazi ideology that privileges anti-Semitism and this idea of sort of ethnic superiority or racial superiority, whatever it is. And indeed, Theodore does express some sympathy for the Nazis and their objectives. Prager, when he comes in slightly later in the play, he kind of brings all these sort of strange messages that, like, Europe has been united under the Reich and things like this, that resistance in Europe has collapsed, that the Nazis have basically won, which of course we know did not actually occur. So it is this very interesting thing where, because that's another sort of part of both wartime counter-propaganda, I guess, but also of colonial service in many cases, was that rumors were rife. There were all different kinds of rumors about all different kinds of things. And in this case, they are political rumors in the sense that if Europe has been united under the Nazis and there is no more Dutch government as such, then the nature of Dutch colonialism is fundamentally undermined. But again, Theodore, who wants to maintain his power and control in this colony, is basically sympathetic to Nazi aims, which puts him in a somewhat awkward position when Alban shows up, because Alban is, again, a Jewish refugee from the Netherlands who's arrived in this colony trying to make his way ultimately to America, even though he doesn't really want to be in America. He's a weird sort of curmudgeonly misanthrope, a really, really skilled violinist, apparently, who no longer plays the violin because under Nazi laws, he was forced out of his position in a very prominent orchestra. So you've got all that stuff. So again, the sort of key focus ultimately of the play is this sort of paralleling of the racial and supremacist ideologies that underpin colonialism and the racial and supremacist ideologies that underpin Nazism. And this is a kind of working through of Dutch colonial guilt, right? This is central to the play. Now, I said I am somewhat confused by this play. And I don't know whence my confusion arises. I don't know if it's there are things that I missed in reading this that were clear in the play, and I just, for whatever reason, didn't get them, or whether this is an issue of like translation and how clear the translation is. Maybe in the original Dutch version, De Boer's writing was extremely clear, but the translators didn't convey it amazingly well for whatever reason. And there's a number of there's a number of things about translation. Different people take different approaches. You can choose to try and preserve the sound of someone's writing, or you can try and make the meaning as clear as possible. You can do these different things because different languages work in different ways. So I don't know. It may be a translation issue. It may also be an issue of on stage, these things would make more sense because, of course, plays are half of an art form, right? They're meant to be performed. And so maybe when enacted, this would be a lot clearer than it is for me as I'm reading it on the page. That's another possibility. But there are things that I think are... And then the other thing is that De Boer, from what the introduction in this collection was saying, De Boer is part of a sort of... He's on the more traditional side of a sort of experimental expansion in Dutch and Flemish drama, really starting in sort of the late 60s. The mechanics of Dutch and Flemish theater changed, in part because new sources of funding were sort of allocated by the government to support the performing arts, et cetera, et cetera. And so people started doing things that were not as sort of traditional and limited as the Dutch theater canon had been. And De Boer is part of that movement, but he seems to be less experimental and more... He's closer to sort of realist drama, but he's not a realist necessarily. So it may also be that De Boer's experimental bits and pieces in this play are what's kind of throwing me off in terms of my understanding of it. But I'll give you an example of one of the things that really jumped out at me as I don't feel like that makes sense. Alban, the refugee, his wife is Hannah, or Hannah. It seems like when he first introduces her to Theodore and Athalie, that he introduces her as his half-sister. Then he refers to her as his wife. And nobody questions that. Nobody's like, wait, that seems weird. Are you married to your half-sister? Because that's probably not good. There's just no mention of it at all. And it may be that I'm sort of confused about that because Alban talks about a sort of extended family network. My understanding, and this may or may not be 100% right, is that Alban was adopted by this family who the father was Dutch or Belgian possibly, and the mother was from Hong Kong. And Hannah is half Dutch or Belgian and half Chinese. And my sense is, and again, I don't know if this is 100% right, that that he was basically her adopted brother, and then they got married, but then she also just sort of abandons him. So I don't know. It's a weird bit, and I'm not 100% clear about it. So it's little things like that. Like the overall arc of the play, I'm reasonably clear on. But there's small details where I'm like, wait, that doesn't seem consistent. So again, I don't know where that confusion comes from, whether it's my reading of it, whether it's the translation, whether it's DeBoer's style, whether it's I'm not seeing this performed, whatever it is.